What happens when your fear of being manipulated causes you to become manipulated?
This is only a test. This is only a test. This is only a test. Voluntary cooperation. This station is conducting a test.
Hello and welcome to the Uncover Up. I'm one of your co-hosts, Nathan Radke, and joining me in the bunker is, of course, Dr. Lee Kunla.
Hi, Nathan. Hi, everyone.
All right, so here's the thing. We've been doing this a long time,
Sure have.
and there are some frustrations with this job of studying conspiracy theories.
I mean, look, all in all, it's a pretty good job.
It's an amazing job.
We're enjoying a lot of our day.
Yep.
But even so, even with the best jobs in the world, you can have minor frustrations here and there.
And one of the frustrations has to do with the fact that there is an aspect of conspiracy theories that gets completely ignored, particularly by the people who believe the conspiracy theory.
Yes.
People often believe a conspiracy theory because they are concerned that they're being manipulated.
Right.
A very understandable fear.
Yeah.
Something that I think everybody should be paying attention to. But then there's an irony in that the conspiracy theories themselves, when they are false, are actually weaponized tools to manipulate people.
That's right.
We've been studying this forever. If there was one thing that I would want to really stress, it is that. It is that false conspiracy theories can be used to manipulate people.
Exactly. And that's really the theme of our podcast today. What we want to talk about is times in which conspiracies are generated by people in power. Think the CIA or the government writ large.
Or the KGB.
Right, exactly. And indeed, as you mentioned the KGB, we have actually touched this theme in all of our disinformation episodes, because this is really the playbook in disinformation is that organizations that have a lot of power create false conspiracies in order to manipulate a population, in this case of a political enemy. But what we're going to suggest is that this is just an element of some conspiracy theories as such, that they have this dimension of social control, of generating conformity and obedience in populations of people who believe them. And maybe that is their purpose. And the way I like to put this is sometimes the conspiracy theory itself is the conspiracy.
And there is something specific about the nature of conspiracy theories that makes them extremely powerful in this regard.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of different forms of social control, obviously.
Sure.
But there's something very specific about the false conspiracy theory that makes it extremely powerful, extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
We can see, and again, it drives me bananas, because people are worried about being vulnerable, and then they become more vulnerable to things like scams. Not at the social control level, but at the scam level, which has some similar aspects to it.
Definitely. I mean, that's definitely one of the genres of a false conspiracy being deliberately perpetuated in order, in this case, to gain financial means, like to scam people of money.
Remember we did that episode on conspiracy-related financial scams, and remember the entire time, because of the research I've been doing, because of the field work I've been doing...
You were constantly being invited to get scammed.
Yeah, my phone was lighting up the entire time.
Is it still,
recording.
by the way, years later?
After we did that episode, and I didn't need to do that research anymore, I removed myself from those communities because it was exhausting and it was too sad. But it was extraordinary. The entire episode, my phone was lighting up with people offering crypto, basically.
Yeah.
And every time it lit up, my heart sank a little bit because I thought, right, this is a vulnerable population. There are these parasites out here.
Yeah, who are scamming.
That are going to manipulate through conspiracy theories.
Yeah. Now, of course, longtime listeners will know this refrain that we keep coming back to, which is that obviously some conspiracies are true, and obviously some conspiracies are not true, and there are then some that are in the middle for which we don't yet have enough evidence to be able to determine one way or the other. What we're talking about in this episode are conspiracies that we know are not true, as in they're like the main claims that the conspiracy theory itself makes. They're not correct. We know that retrospectively. And yet they were disseminated for a particular reason, usually for social control of some sort.
Yeah, these are conspiracies that weren't discovered. They weren't uncovered. they were engineered.
Yes.
These are conspiracy theories that were engineered rather than found out.
Now, I want to start us off with two examples from popular culture that are fiction, from the world of fiction, but I think which help us get the kind of, or the way in which we imagine it, and then sometimes the way we get manipulated. The first example I want to give comes from a film that we've already done a deep dive on called They Live. And if you haven't watched the movie, stop the podcast right now and go watch it, because it's a great movie. And we have also an episode just where we kind of geek out on it and had a lot of fun. But in that film, the protagonist finds a pair of sunglasses that when he puts them on, allow him to see the world as it actually is. He's able to cut through the illusion to the underlying truth that's been hidden, been veiled from him. And I think this is exactly how conspiracy theorists, be those of real or imagined conspiracies, doesn't matter for our purposes here, but this is the way conspiracy theorists tend to imagine how reality works. There is the mainstream narrative, and that's an illusion. That's fiction. That is for the sake of keeping us asleep, keeping us dormant, not knowing the truth because we can't handle the truth.
Because we're the sheeple.
Exactly. And then there is the conspiratorial narrative, which is subversive, which is against power, and which discovers a truth that is being hidden from us. And
right, like you could pull back the curtain. Everybody's just looking at the curtain, but actually the real machinery is behind that curtain.
Exactly.
And so what the conspiracy theory allows you to do is pull that curtain and open it up and see what's actually going on, or put on the glasses or any of these things.
Exactly. And of course, we know that in the history of both real and not real conspiracies, this is exactly how it sometimes works. Let me give you an example. This is how we imagine, or how conspiracy theorists imagine something like the JFK assassination. There is the mainstream narrative, which says, no, there was only one shooter, and that person was acting alone, and that's all there is to see, and now go home and don't worry about it. And then there are the conspiracy theorists who say, no, there is a much deeper truth here. It is, and then you have your various enemies. It's the CIA who did it. It's the KGB who did it. It's the mafia who did it. It's some combination of all of them. But nonetheless, that the truth is one that is being hidden. And if you use critical reasoning, your suspicion, you are not willing to accept the mainstream narrative, you might be able to discover that. But certainly in real conspiracies, this is indeed how it's happened, right? Like, MK Ultra. It was a group of people who discovered what was going on and pieced together this nefarious thing. All right, so that's how we both imagine and think that conspiracy theories happen. I want to give you a counterexample, and this one is George Orwell's 1984, book or movie, doesn't matter. And here, the protagonist is living in a world that he thinks is kind of the main ideology is not true. And he doesn't believe it. It's a totalitarian kind of thought dictatorship. And in that, though, he discovers a counter narrative, a subversive narrative. I had to actually remind myself of the character's name, Emmanuel Goldstein. And this is the kind of anti-hero in the book. It's the conspiratorial narrative that says your mainstream stuff is a lie and don't believe it. And the main character and his girlfriend become convinced by this interpretation and kind of engage in dissident political activity. But it turns out at the end of the book that actually Emmanuel Goldstein is a figment created by the ruling party, by the very ideology itself, in order to ensnare political radicals and find them and capture them. In this case here, the conspiracy isn't a greater truth. The conspiracy was generated by people in power in order to perpetuate their power.
Right. Because anybody who starts to maybe doubt the totalitarian regime, they would get caught up in this in this other movement,
Yeah.
not realizing that the other movement is designed as a honey trap.
Exactly. And so that's what we wanted to explore a little bit in this episode is instances where the conspiracy theory is not correct, but is actually not a version of a deeper truth, even a mistaken one. It's actually a deeper lie. It's created by people in power in order to generate conformity and obedience.
Right. The conspiracy theory is actually a weaponized tool used to control people.
Yes. Or as I like to put it, sometimes the conspiracy theory is the conspiracy.
I've tried to put it that way in lectures sometimes, but then some of the students think what I'm saying is the conspiracy theory is true.
Which is not what I meant.
I know, and then I got to unpack it.
Yes.
And I know.
That's the problem with pithy statements sometimes.
It is.
But let me give you an example from my own life, okay? Because this is a conspiracy that I grew up with and that did impact my behavior to some marginal extent. And of all the examples, this is the one that I'm unable to trace it back to an actual authoritative source. But I think nonetheless it's really helpful in showing how conspiracy narratives can impact behavior, especially when we're looking to generate certain normative behaviors. Okay, so it's Toronto, Canada in the early 90s, and at that point, cannabis, marijuana, pot, it's not legal. Not only is it not legal, there is a theory that has been accepted by large segments of the population known as the gateway drug theory, that if a young person engages in recreational cannabis use, they might or they will almost as though almost beyond their control keep trying harder and more dangerous drugs.
Yeah, it's a classic slippery slope fallacy.
Exactly.
As soon as you start your way down the slippery slope, it's slippery. And it's a slope.
And then
you're going to slide all the way down.
Exactly.
So you start, I'm going to try weed.
Yeah.
Oh, now I'm trying mushrooms. Oh, I'm trying LSD.
Yeah.
I'm trying Coke.
Yeah.
I'm trying heroin. And then I'm behind the 7-Eleven wearing a garbage bag for Coke.
Exactly.
If you do this first thing, all of the other things will happen.
Now, that is not a very good theory of drug use. It's not a good theory, as I understand it, when it comes especially to cannabis use. I don't know if that theory has any legs at all, but it certainly does not work well.
If you looked at people who had tried heroin, a great proportion of them would have tried cannabis.
Sure.
Also, a great proportion of them would have had potato chips.
Yes.
Or
smoked a cigarette.
Or watched a movie.
Right, exactly. So the point here, though, is that there were a lot of people who were very worried, quite genuinely, that if young people were trying something naively, that they would be wrapped up in something a lot scarier pretty quickly. So in this context, then, of a drug being illegal and potentially dangerous, there was a story that emerged, which I just referred to as laced weed. Mm-hmm. And the idea was that unscrupulous dealers were mixing other drugs with the marijuana in order to make the consumers more addicted to them. So because marijuana itself is not as addictive as many other drugs, say tobacco, for example, they were adding things like, and here we had PCP, which was I think it was a horse tranquilizer, I'm not sure, or potentially cocaine, mm-hmm. or potentially LSD, or potentially some mixture of a lot of different drugs. And so that if you tried this, you might think that you're using a relatively harmless drug, but in fact, you could be subjecting yourself to something that could give you a heart attack, that could land you in hospital, that could make you addicted and to something really strong that you don't have any control over. Now, to the best of my knowledge, there is no evidence of this ever happening, that there was ever large quantities of marijuana seized by the police, and it was demonstrated that that was also mixed with an even stronger drug of some sort. So let's just assume for a moment that this was not at all true, that there was no marijuana that was laced. You can nonetheless, though, see how this might start impacting behavior in precisely the way we want behavior to be impacted if we are mainstream adults worried about recreational cannabis use among our youth, right?
Yeah. It's like, I mean, we often see this with urban legends.
Yeah.
Urban legends are there often as a form of social control. You take some kind of change that's happening in your society, you make a really spooky story about it.
Yeah.
About how somebody who exceeds a social norm and then they get punished beyond belief in a
Yes.
grotesque and gruesome way.
Yeah.
Which you have to do because that increases the chances of somebody telling the story
Right.
if it's gruesome and gross.
Yeah.
But part of what that story is there for is to try to prevent a social change from happening.
Right.
And I'm sure we're going to talk about more examples of this.
Yeah. Well, what I think is particularly interesting with these conspiracies that are related around changing people's behavior or curbing it is that you become your own policeman. You police yourself because you now no longer need the police running around behind you or other authority figures saying,
Because
don't.
they're in your brain.
Exactly. Don't smoke the pot, kids. Now you yourself are afraid of it. If you buy into this conspiracy, and why wouldn't you? If you're a young person, what do you know about like what is going on with dealers and who is doing what? And it's already an illegal market. There's no regulation around it. So I think this gives a really interesting kind of template for how to understand the next set of examples that I want to give, just that you could have a conspiracy that kind of like has an impact in curbing behavior. I do want to say that there was in fact an operation done in which a herbicide was sprayed on Mexican marijuana fields in the late 70s, maybe into the early 80s. The herbicide that was used is called paraquat, Paraquat, and this is really highly toxic, and if smoked can damage your lungs. So there have been instances in real life that, in fact, part of a larger conspiracy in which the marijuana was manipulated.
Or during the 1920s prohibition when the government poisoned a bunch of booze.
Yeah. So these things do happen. But the example of the laced weed, the kind of like your dealer is putting PCP in the pot so that it gets a lot stronger and you become addicted, was clearly not that. It wasn't referencing that. It was about effectively getting kids not to use it because they're scared.
Yeah.
So here's an example that actually comes from one of your contacts, and you'll know it in a second. It's the fleas in jeans.
I love this story.
Yeah, so maybe I'll let you tell it.
Right.
The context here is the Soviet Union in the 1980s dealing with people engaging in the black market.
Right. So our Russian translator, Snishana, this shout out to her for telling me this story ages ago. When she was a kid growing up, it was the 1980s. It was the beginning of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviets were very worried at this point, not about a physical American invasion of an army, but of an ideological invasion. Not that the tanks are going to roll into Moscow, but like Billy Joel music might roll into Moscow.
Right.
I mean, and who wants that?
Yeah.
And one of the ways that this ideological invasion was happening was on the black market, where there was American goods. And what's the most American piece of clothing?
Oh, definitely blue jeans.
Exactly. And so American blue jeans, you weren't just putting on a pair of trousers, you were putting on America.
Right.
And so it was a way of almost like sneaking capitalism, like a kind of infection into the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet state was extremely concerned about this because so much of that war was an ideological war. Because again, they couldn't fight each other directly because mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, no, I agree
which
with
marks the 1,000,000th time I've said that. We should have streamers falling from the sky and balloons.
We need fireworks.
Yeah.
Fireworks is the best way to celebrate that.
Agreed.
But I agree with what you're saying. I'd want to emphasize, though, that black markets are a problem for any government's relationship to their economy because it's untaxable.
Yep.
So if you have a robust black market, this is a problem, even if you were ideologically neutral about
even if you're buying Soviet trousers, if you're buying them on the black market, that's still an issue of, to the state, theft.
Exactly, because they're unable to tax it, and that's the main problem. So they can't generate any revenue off of it or get any tax dollars off of it. But there's a situation.
And then a story starts to spread. And the story is that the American government, and this will surprise you because the American government is normally so upstanding, especially in the 1980s, that they have been secretly taking these little glass capsules and sewing them into the seams of these black market jeans. And in those glass capsules is a flea.
Yeah.
And in that flea is syphilis.
Uh-huh.
And so here's what's going to happen. You're going to buy your black market jeans and probably your Billy Joel cassette.
Yep.
And you're going to go home. You're going to crank up Allentown or Uptown Girl, and you're going to put on your jeans. And as you do that, the capsule's going to break, and that flea is going to escape, and it's going to bite you, and it's going to give you syphilis.
Right.
And then you're going to give syphilis to your partners.
Yep. And here again, I think it's wonderful to see how this could work so well, because if you believe it, even if you are worried about it, like, you don't actually need to buy into it wholly. You just need to entertain the suspicion that this could be the case. Like, even with my weed example, I might believe that most dealers wouldn't do it. But do I know that they all won't? And now that doubt has been planted in my brain, and now I, might not buy any as a result.
And not only that, it poisons the well, because then you're saying, well, these black market people, are they actually agents of the Americans?
Yeah.
Like, I thought that I was like bypassing, official channels and getting some good stuff, but actually maybe no, I shouldn't trust these guys at all. I don't know where this stuff is coming from.
Exactly.
And I don't want to be a sucker.
Exactly, right? And so, as you're saying, the suspicion that helps us not be manipulated, I think you mentioned that in the intro, is sometimes the condition that allows us to be manipulated.
Yeah, one of the best ways to manipulate somebody is say, you're being manipulated.
Right.
And then they'll listen to whatever you have to say.
Yeah.
And you can manipulate the hell out of them.
Yeah, so precisely the fact that you don't want to be a sucker, you're like, well, I'm gonna keep myself safe by not buying these blue jeans, and I guess we should just state on record that we have no indication whatsoever that there was any truth to this at all.
And also, if you think about it for a while, none of it makes any sense.
Of course.
Like,
but I wasn't even
how would
gonna
you get a flea into the glass capsule?
Keep it alive for however long.
Do fleas carry syphilis?
I don't even know.
None of this makes any sense.
Right? Exactly. But I wasn't going to go down that road, because if you do, you will miss a lot of actual American operations that have actually happened.
And some including fleas. Like Big Itch. Operation Big Itch was an attempt to weaponize fleas. We have a whole episode about
Exactly. So I wasn't even going to go down the whole doesn't make sense stuff.
Right, because a lot of stuff doesn't make sense. But this one really doesn't make sense.
It really doesn't make sense, and we don't have any evidence. All we know, though, is that this was actually a problem for the Soviets and their relationship to the black market, or at least the leadership. And this was a way of curtailing that, because if you got people to believe it, then they police themselves.
And also distrust America and the West.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'll give you another example that is very similar to that. It comes from East Germany. Now, we're in the 1980s. This is communist East Germany. It's the GDR. And here's the problem that the GDR has. It's awfully close to West Germany. It used to be the same country a few years ago. So the
same language,
same
history.
Everything. Now, the other thing is the television broadcast signals from West Germany, you can get those in East Germany. With your regular old television set and
with your little rabbit ears.
With your little rabbit ears, you can watch West German television. Now,
and vice versa.
Yes, but that was not an issue.
Right.
So it's officially not allowed. You're not supposed to watch West German television, but it's hard to get people not to do it. Now, the problem here is also that when you see West German television, you see a representation of the West that is totally at odds with the way the East German government was representing the West. And if you otherwise didn't have any connections to the West, now a lot of people did have family, and so they would hear stories that would confirm that things were different than what they were being told. Nonetheless, when you see it every day on TV, how affluent things seem to be in the West, the explanations you got from East German officials that this was all a big show basically for the benefit of East Germany seemed a little much of a stretch. In this context, a conspiracy theory emerges that West Germans are actually using these broadcasts to brainwash people. And the mechanism here, whatever, it doesn't really need to be explained or elaborated. It could be through subliminal messaging. It could be through some kind of like beam, some kind of science fiction stuff like filling.
All you need to say is beam.
Right?
How is this done? A beam? Okay,
beam.
well, a beam.
Right?
Look out.
And the idea was that if you watch these programs, you would in fact become ideologically infected. Now, you probably were in a very different sense because you were just like, oh, wait, it doesn't look quite as crappy as they're telling me it is. And certainly my situation is crappy. But their idea was, no, you're actually going to become like an agent of the West, and you're not going to have self-control, and you're not going to know who you are anymore. And so again, it was this idea that we plant doubt into people's minds, the effect of which will be to curb their behavior in which we, the people in power, want. In a way, by making them their own policemen, by having them police themselves.
Yeah, and their loved ones.
Yeah,
if you're
of course.
a parent and you come in and your kid's watching West German TV, you're going to like run across the room and yank the cord out of the
Turn that
wall.
off, exactly.
Because I don't want my kid getting all these subliminal messages thrown into them.
Right.
Now, of course, and again, it's going to get complicated. There's always in media a kind of ideological brainwashing.
Yeah, sure.
And the representation of the West in those, because it was TV, it would have been sort of this very, obviously, like shiny, glitzy version.
Oh, of course. I mean, even now, you watch any television show.
Look at the apartments that the
Yes.
Friends on Friends had.
I know.
In New York City.
That's a hilariously dated example for you. I would have assumed you could have come up with something from 2024.
When's the last time anybody watched TV?
Well, I guess TV is very broadly conceived now. I mean, people still watch shows, don't they?
I don't know.
So, no, you're right that there is a kind of an ideological...
But not the mechanism from these stories.
No,
Not subliminal seduction, just...
And also this kind of the notion of brainwashing, which we've talked about in previous episodes when it came to, say, MK Ultra, relies on a theory of psychology that is just not accepted by mainstream psychiatrists, right? Or neurologists and people who study this kind of stuff do not see the brain as essentially a computer program that can be erased and a new program can be uploaded. Like, that's just not how brains work.
Although they tried.
Well, of course they did.
They sure tried.
That's one of the good indices that we have that it did not work at all.
They were good at breaking the brains. They just couldn't rebuild the brains afterwards, which is tragic.
Exactly. These are just some of the arguments or some of the examples I wanted to bring to the podcast today to suggest that sometimes the conspiracy is the condition that gets us manipulated. It's produced by people in power. It isn't always the subversive kind of discovery of a truth that is meant to be kept from us.
You think to yourself, I'm going to believe this conspiracy theory because I don't want to be a sucker. And
Exactly.
you don't realize, no, that's the thing that's going to make you a sucker, tragically. And again, I see this constantly in my field work where somebody rejects the official story, understandably.
Yes.
Because official stories are like just absolutely rife with inaccuracies and manipulations. But then it leaves them open to anybody who comes along with some snake oil.
Yep, exactly.
And it's just one of the most tragic aspects of the work I do is seeing how much snake oil gets peddled to these people because they're afraid of being manipulated.
So I guess we do want to be suspicious. I think that that's important. I think
We want to be skeptical.
We want to be skeptical.
We don't want to be paranoid.
We don't want to be paranoid. But I think that sometimes we need to be skeptical of the skepticism, right? Is that this being skeptical isn't just the first step or the only step, I guess.
Well, being skeptical gets us away from the official story, but it shouldn't then just drive us into the arms of whatever conspiracy theory is sitting in a window saying, come here, big boy.
Exactly. Now, I wonder if we could do a thought experiment. If we were to, with our knowledge now of having gone through both real and false conspiracies, looking at various psyops and disinformation campaigns, if we were to be cynical operatives, let's say we were the head of an intelligence outfit and we were looking to undermine democracy, okay? Just for argument's sake. Could we use some of these tools to do it? Could we generate, or what are some of the ideas that we need to keep in mind to generate effective conspiracies that will undermine the established narrative, keep people under control, keep them obedient, get them listening to what we say.
Or, to put that in a pithy way, what if we had a recipe for authoritarian power stew?
Okay.
Step one, this is the background.
Okay.
You've got a country that has a democracy.
Okay.
Democracies are designed to keep the government relatively weak. That's the whole point of a democracy, because occasionally you can just turf them out.
Yep.
And they have to go.
Yep.
But democracy...
I would say also, sorry, just because that does touch on some of my backgrounds. I would say also the whole point of democracy is that the people get to choose, that they are in fact the leaders, even if not directly, and that there is...
As opposed to some kind of like royal family situation where the people are afraid of the monarch, now the government should be afraid of the will of the people.
Exactly. And also what democracies tend to do pretty well is that they have a built-in legitimation of itself. Like, why should I listen to these guys? Like, as you say, like, why should I listen to the monarch? Well, God put the monarch in place. But what if you don't believe that? Then there's no more reason to believe.
It's just some inbred guy.
Right?
Sorry, Lee's mom.
Who just for clarity is not inbred. She just happens to be a fan of the royal family.
Yes,
I felt
thank
like
you for that
being her
clarification.
son, I needed to really clarify that part. Now you've got me off track. Hold on, what were we saying?
You were saying democracy does some things...
Legitimation.
Yes. Why do I have to listen to this guy? Because
we decided to listen to this
or
one.
whatever system that you're using.
Yeah.
Yeah. So democracy's got some stuff going for it.
Yeah.
I would say that I am actually pro-democracy.
I am definitely pro-democracy. Although here the skeletons are it's there's a lot that's buried in what do we mean by democracy.
Well, I mean, who gets to vote? Like, what are the mechanisms that people are denied their votes? Exactly. All of these things have happened. We haven't had a perfect democracy, but I mean, the thing about democracies is they are also messy and irritating.
They are definitely messy and irritating.
I mean, there's lots of checks and balances in them.
Yeah.
There has to be. You have things like division of power.
Yeah.
You don't want a czar. You don't want a Caesar. You don't want to elect a guy and then he just has all of the power all of the time. That's authoritarianism.
Yep.
And so you want it spread out amongst things like you have parliament or you have Congress and you've got like a separate judiciary. You've got freedom of the press. You have all these safeguards and things. But let's say you're in one of those situations and you're a leader and you're tired of those safeguards. You don't want those safeguards. You would prefer to have an authoritarian dictatorship. How do you work towards undermining your democracy and replacing it with an authoritarian dictatorship? You have to start, to make this stew, to make this authoritarian stew, you got to start with a strong base, like with any stew. So your broth should be rich in social issues. Social inequality, which exists in all societies. Tiresome bureaucracy, which tends to come along with democracies. Infrastructure issues. Changing technologies. Changing industry. All of these things that are happening that all put a stress on your society. Because it is difficult to keep up with the change of pace, and at the same time you're dealing with these bureaucracies which seem to slow you down and interfere, and paperwork and all these other things. So you start with that, you stir it up a little bit. Add a sprinkling of some divisive identity issues. Maybe, I mean, we're in Canada. What would be a great one in Canada would be something like language. Because here in Canada, we've got a French province and then a bunch of English provinces.
Yeah.
And historically, that's a division that you can work with.
That's one of them. You have historically Protestants and Catholics.
Yep. Yeah, culture, religion, all of these things. They're going to exist. Awkward historical events.
Awkward is a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, well, that was awkward. Perceived political ineptitude.
Sure.
So all of these things. So we got a good base. But now we're going to add a secret ingredient. And the secret ingredient we're going to add is some conspiracy theory. So you want a nice, tasty one. You want a good, tasty conspiracy theory. It should be broad enough to allow you to apply it to all of the problems you see in society. But it shouldn't be so broad to make political change appear impossible. So you want an enemy that's pretty powerful and pretty nefarious so that they're manipulating everything. But if you make that enemy too powerful, then people are going to say, well, what can I do about that?
Yeah.
So deep state is good.
Deep state. I was going to suggest deep state.
Shape-shifting, all-powerful aliens is bad.
Yeah, not as good.
Yeah, because what are you gonna do?
What are you going to do? Or aliens that have generated an illusion that has captivated all of us, and we're actually just like in a vat somewhere living out like this.
The Matrix, basically.
Yeah. How do you fight against that?
Yeah. What are you going to? And so then that'll just that isn't the effect that you want to have.
No.
All right. So there's a couple other aspects that you're going to want in your conspiracy theory. You're going to want Manichaeism.
Okay.
Which is something that I know I talk about constantly.
Yeah.
To the point where I'm going to ask you about it to see if you've been listening to me.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a dualism, right? It's basically a religious view in which there are kind of two poles. There's the good and there's the bad. And they're usually, although there is a bit of flex here, they're usually of equal power. Yep. Sometimes the good is slightly better, but only, right at the end, the good wins out, something like that.
Barely ekes out a victory.
Exactly.
It was a close one.
Yeah.
It was a real buzzer beater.
So we're talking about a kind of a way in which we see the world as being divided up into these two forces, good and evil. That's Manichaeanism, and this is a key element that we have the in and out group, where the in group is defined as good, the out group is defined as evil.
Yep.
And
And the reason why this is so important, because it takes a complex gray situation, which, let's face it, every situation is, and particularly social issues are going to be complicated and gray. Takes that, just puts them into black and white.
Yeah.
So much clearer.
Yeah.
So much less accurate, but so much clearer.
Yeah.
Good guys, bad guys. And then by definition, if you're the good, anybody who opposes you
is evil.
Is
of course.
evil.
Yeah.
And this allows you to discredit your opponents without having to bother addressing their arguments or their positions. It doesn't matter what their arguments or positions are. Because they oppose you, because you are good, anything that they're doing must be for the purpose of evil.
Yeah.
And then also you can accuse them of all sorts of ridiculous, nonsensical things that wouldn't make any sense to actually do. Why would anybody do those things?
Because they're evil.
Because they're evil.
Yeah.
And even better, anybody who disagrees with you is no longer just an opponent. They're an enemy. They're the enemy. And this is also one of the first steps in an extremely important procedure, the dehumanization of the people who oppose you. Because here's the thing, and this always surprises my students. It surprises me every time I say it. Human beings tend to be pretty decent.
Yeah. I mean, it's really contextual. I think I get what you're saying.
In fact, even in disasters, where you assume, this will be the purge in like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
If you look at Hurricane Katrina, if you look at earthquakes, of course there are going to be some horrendous acts committed, but for the most part, people act better in those situations.
Sure.
And far better than you would expect them to, which actually makes sense when you think about human beings as an animal and how squishy we are, and how slow we are, and how easy we are to choke, and how our nails are lousy and our teeth are not sharp. And we're out here surrounded by these giant bears and
we got to work together. That's for sure.
And blue-ringed octopus, and even squirrels can beat us up sometimes. So we work together.
Yeah.
We have empathy for each other, and that allows us to cooperate, which is why humans are really kicking a lot of ass. We tend to be pretty decent towards our fellow human beings. We also tend to be less decent.
We can also be horrendous.
And have been, but here's the thing. We tend to be less decent against those that we don't see as fully human.
Right. So the dehumanization process is one of the steps towards being horrible to other people.
And when you look at the most horrible things that we've done, I can't think of an example that didn't have that process in it. I can't think of an example that didn't first have that dehumanizing process. It is hard to get people to do monstrous things to other people. But it is less hard to then convince those people that the other people aren't people.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden the monstrousness comes easier.
Yeah. I think bureaucracies have another interesting role in that. Like, if I am not the only cog in the machine that is doing the monstrous things, if I am not actually responsible for doing the monstrous things, there's all these other elements.
Sure. I mean, things like the Milgram shock experiment.
Yeah,
like all
those demonstrate it. Yeah.
But this is why Manichaeism is so powerful, because it simplifies things. It also provides you with an enemy. It makes you good. Anything you do is therefore
good. Yeah.
Right. And anything you do to your enemy, you're doing to somebody who is evil
and who deserves it, and therefore making the world better.
Yep.
Yeah. And you're
Cleansing.
right. I think it's conceptually a very appealing paradigm.
Yeah. For a meta conspiracy.
Yeah.
Another aspect is millenarianism. And this is end of the world year, and so we've been talking a lot about millenarianism. It's this idea that there is an event coming, an inevitable event that is going to cleanse the world.
Call it a storm, perhaps.
Yeah. The storm is coming.
The storm is coming.
Yeah.
To cleanse the world of the deep state.
To cleanse the world of the deep state. And again, this is a belief that humans have had for ages. We talked about the Book of Revelation.
Yep.
Before then, we talked about fresh ready. Like this is an idea that we are thirsty for.
Yep.
And it's important.
Especially, sorry if I could just throw in there that idea that we developed in the podcast on the apocalyptic genre. If you are suffering, like if you are yourself a victim of social injustice, lack of access to resources, precisely then it can be a really appealing position.
Yeah, that this event is coming.
And is going to hurt the bad people. It's going to cleanse the world of the injustice. I will get my own back. I will be made whole.
Things will be amazing forever. It's the making wonderful.
Yeah.
And you need to have an event that over the top. Because on the one hand, you have to provide the people with an enemy that is insidious and threatening and all-powerful. But on the other hand, you need your followers to believe that victory is coming. And if the situation is so dire, and you have to make it dire to get them scared, a conventional political remedy is not going to do the trick. You're not going to find your remedy through the conventional methods of, political activism and voting and things like that. Things are too messed up for that.
Yeah.
We need something bigger. We need something bolder. The only thing that's going to fix the extreme situation that you are pushing towards your followers is an extreme solution in the form of, ultimately, a massacre.
Or things related to that, like mass deportations, purges, large imprisonments, things like that. Like some kind of very severe kind of quote-unquote correction.
Yeah, and we've seen this historically. Throughout history, humans have done things like this, of course.
No. So can we put some flesh on this? Because it sounds, when you're talking, it sounds very much like you are describing a contemporary situation.
Well, I'm also describing several historical situations.
Okay.
The Communist Revolution, when the Soviet Union was created, that was a millenarian movement.
Yeah, okay.
They were going to purify. They were going to eliminate, it was also a Manichaean movement. They were going to eliminate the impurities. They were going to create a socialist paradise. The way to do that was, unfortunately, through the Red Terror and just so much killing. Like just so much killing was involved in that. You can look back to the terror of the French Revolution. Again, they were creating a utopia. They were building a utopia. If we could just kill the right people, we can make a utopia. We can kill ourselves there.
Yeah.
We see it over and over again. We saw it with the Shoah in the 30s and 40s.
Right. Which is, just because that's not as well known a term, it tends to be referred to as the Holocaust.
The Holocaust, yeah, exactly. The undesirables are removed in order to create some kind of imagined situation.
And there's the all good, and then there's the all evil. There's the wholesome German, and then the degenerate others.
And the overt discussion of the purity of blood.
Yes,
they are poisoning the soil. These evil creatures are poisoning the soil, and we also see the dehumanization, referring to people as cockroaches and animals and things like that.
Yeah. And so in all of these cases, we can see how the conspiratorial narratives actually are serving power interests, that they are not necessarily always this citizen sleuth uncovering a greater truth. Sometimes that is the case. And sometimes we're getting played.
Sometimes we're being suckers. Okay, and so what are the effects that you're trying to have on the population at this point? This is something that we talked about with Evan in a few episodes ago. Rage farming, fear-mongering.
Yep.
Ultimately, you want the people to feel afraid and angry. You want to tap into feelings of humiliation, of relative deprivation. You want them to think, these people are taking advantage of you.
Yeah, the free rider problem.
Yeah, these people are ripping you off. And from a psychological perspective, I also did a whole episode on this. We've had a lot of episodes.
A lot of over 150 now, right?
Yeah, yikes. It's time for you to get a tattoo.
No.
From a psychological perspective, when we feel out of control of a situation, we are more prone to seeing patterns that aren't really there.
Okay, and this actually goes back to a study. Was it Peter Berger who does this study? It's a study where this was in corporate environments, and people were given images that were basically just line scribbles. Mm-hmm. And they were told that there was an image there. And as their feelings of uncertainty increased, the likelihood that they would see images in these squiggly lines that didn't actually contain any image, that also increased. So the idea that these researchers took from that was that this sense of pattern recognition, which might be a survival advantage,
it absolutely
is heightened in periods of uncertainty and fear.
Which makes perfect sense, because pattern recognition is ultimately threat detection.
Right.
And so if you feel like, oh, there's something going on here, there's something going wrong, then that part of your brain, which is going to be like, okay, one of the things you can do to protect yourself,
exactly.
You can have like energy go away from your digestive system into your muscles, so you can run away, and your brain can start kicking in, okay, what is the pattern here that I should see?
Right.
Which is going to also make us see more false patterns. And this is important because to get your conspiracy to catch on, you're going to need a large group of people to see the specific illusory pattern that you're priming them for.
Yeah.
Which is an easier task in a frightened population who are then going to become more prone to seeing patterns. And fortunately, you've got a mechanism through which to do that because we have this massive media ecosystem now. And the state of both social media and mainstream media contributes to your ability to spread your conspiracy theory. Because in the media ecosystem, disinformation, lies, have an evolutionary advantage over the truth.
Yeah. And this is also something that has been repeatedly demonstrated in studies, sociological studies looking at flows of information within media systems, that lies or untruths tend to travel faster and reach more people than the truth does.
They go further and they go faster. And this is because it makes perfect sense. Think about the qualities that disinformation can have. Short, shocking, novel. You can conform to people's biases.
Yep.
Because it isn't burdened by accuracy.
Yep.
It is freed of accuracy. It doesn't need to be accurate. It can quickly mutate and shift and change and adapt to changing situations.
Yeah.
Like if there's a new fear in your society, if there's a new division, if there's a new event, then you can just tweak your conspiracy to include that, because this is the advantage of not having to worry about what's true.
Yeah.
Now, at this point, we've sort of, for the purposes of being pithy, we've been talking about somebody doing all of this deliberately and kind of like there's been an agent in this who's been behind all of this stuff.
You might almost say we've been talking about it conspiratorially.
Yes,
as though this is how it works in real life, that there is like a conspiracy czar somewhere who concocts these conspiratorial narratives and then gives them to their political leaders and says, look, this is going to manipulate the population this way.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, to a degree that is sort of true within elements of...
Sure, with disinformation campaigns in the KGB, that's exactly
CIA,
how it worked.
KGB, FBI, that is how it worked. But it's obviously more complicated than that. There's examples of large-scale disinformation campaigns that weren't done for a specific political purpose.
No.
They were just done to generate views and make money.
Yeah.
And it just happens that for the exact reasons we just said, conspiracy stuff is going to do better. So they're putting out the conspiracy stuff because it's going to make them money.
Yeah.
During the 2016 American election, there was this small town in Macedonia that just started pumping out all sorts of absurd and ridiculous conspiracy theories. It became like the town's economy.
The clearinghouse, the conspiracy clearinghouse.
Yeah. And they were absolutely uninterested in what the outcome of the American election was.
Right.
That's not why they were doing this. But those stories did well because of the political climate, because of the social climate. And so they generated income. Now, of course, the end effect is still flooding the zone with nonsense and lies. So there was a political impact, but it wasn't something that they were doing for the political impact. The political impact was almost just a side project of what they were trying to do, which was just make some coin.
Yeah. And I just want to emphasize Nathan's point, because this is something that, as a political theorist, I sometimes am a little allergic to, telling the story in politics as though we are all actors in this story. And that isn't often how social and political change happens. That's not how social and political ideas emerge. Very often, these emerge organically within populations. And so you don't need the government. Let's take the UFO conspiracy again, right? Once the UFO conspiracy exists as a conspiracy, the United States, elements of the United States government, for example, like Air Force intelligence, can use that story strategically for their own purposes and do use it strategically for their own purposes. But they didn't generate it ex nihilo.
No.
They didn't generate it out of nothing.
And we know that's the case because we've seen like countless files about the Air Force intelligence or the CIA trying to react to what was happening on the ground in the early 50s and late 40s
or
with the
potentially
UFO.
figure it out,
Yeah.
right? Like, is
and
this...
say, guys, what is this stuff?
Yeah. So while we, for narrative purposes, have suggested, well, how would you do it if you were an operative in, say, the KGB or the CIA, and you were tasked with this? Okay, this might be the brief you give to your analysts and say, okay, here's what we got to do. Here are the parameters. Now go do it. In real life, I think there are a lot of different inputs into a political ideology, a lot of which are generated from below, as it were.
Yeah, more organic.
But then get instrumentalized in various ways.
Now, having said all of that,
Yes.
there's also examples of deliberate and directed,
Of course.
like either from foreign agencies who have an interest in manipulating
Well, that's the
public.
disinformation stuff, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
The Internet Research Agency out
Yeah.
of St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
Or domestic agencies trying to do something in their own country, like Cambridge Analytica.
Yep, exactly.
So we do also have examples of, no, this is deliberate.
Yeah.
But the whole thing is a big complicated mess.
Yeah. So, well, I guess what I would want to take away from an episode like this is not that if somebody has been duped by conspiracy theories that are clearly benefiting certain power groups, to then reverse engineer that idea
That
as
group must have
that
engineered this conspiracy.
must have designed this, and we're now they're playing the long con, and we're all victims of it. I don't think that's often the case.
Although, and then sometimes...
Wait, what is it that we're saying?
There's one last bit that we need in this stew.
Yeah, okay.
To really sort of seize control and to eliminate the democracy in your society and to replace it with an authoritarian regime, you're going to need some kind of crisis.
Yeah.
Now, occasionally, you got to add a little bit of spice to this stew, and it can take the form of an attack on the population. Mm-hmm. And sometimes what you can do is you can take advantage of an attack that you didn't know about. You certainly didn't cause it. You didn't engineer it. It's just a thing that happened.
Yeah.
And you can take advantage of it. For example, the burning...
I don't know.
The burning of the Reichstag.
Yeah, or, I don't know, 9/11.
Right, also. But I mean, the burning of the Reichstag...
Yep. That's a great example.
There was a guy.
A guy.
A guy did that.
Probably suffering from mental health issues.
Yeah, certainly he had a bunch of health issues. He had financial issues.
Yep.
He did have links to communists.
Yeah.
Sorta.
Sure.
I mean, not that unusual at the time. By the way, burning of the Reichstag. This is
I guess.
Germany.
Right, yes.
Early 1930s.
Yep.
The Nazis have, through elaborate and complicated political methods, have gotten into sort of power. Mm-hmm. They haven't become like they haven't
Not the
grabbed,
ruling party, but they're there. They're
Yeah.
players.
They don't have totalitarian power.
No.
They're still in a democracy. Mm-hmm. And then the Reichstag, the parliament buildings, are burned down.
Yep.
And in this, despite the fact that this was probably almost certainly done by just this one guy, Marinus van der Lubbe, the right wing, the Nazis, immediately do what with this event?
Well, they blame a scapegoat. They say that this was done by the communists and that this was...
Like a massive, sweeping
Exactly.
conspiracy.
Exactly. And they implicate, like, not just a communist or a small faction, but that this is the work of global communism, communism's infiltration into Germany, the German parliament, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And of course, what did the left say about the burning of the Reichstag? Who did they blame?
The Nazis?
Yeah, they said the Nazis did it as a false flag attack, which there also isn't really evidence. Like, the evidence seems to suggest it was this guy.
It was this dude, yeah.
And so both the left and the right there grabbed up conspiracies. Mm-hmm. And the right did so for a specific political purpose, which was then basically turning that democracy into a totalitarian regime. Because now all of a sudden you're saying, well, there is this terrifying threat, and the only way we can possibly defeat it is if we have more power. And when people are afraid, they're willing to give up, or they tend to be willing to give up freedom for safety, or the illusion of safety, or the promise of safety.
Yeah.
Only we can fix this.
Yeah.
There is this imminent threat. Only we can fix this. The judiciary we can no longer afford to have an independent system of judges. We can no longer afford to have freedom of the press. We can no longer afford to have checks and balances. We need to consolidate all of the power in this small group so that they can do what needs to be done. And then at that point, you have lost your democracy.
Right.
And then the horrors are going to unfold. And sometimes, because this crisis is so useful, sometimes you got to help things along a little bit by maybe putting your finger on the scales. 1999, a bunch of bombs went off in Russian apartment buildings. And there was, again, a massive, in this case, a Chechen conspiracy that was blamed for this. The prime minister of Russia at the time was a young man named Vladimir Putin. And he was able to use the fear and the anxiety and the terror that was caused by this event in order to, again, consolidate more power. He becomes the president. He becomes the Putin that we know now.
Yeah.
His approval rating shoots up. But who blew up those apartment buildings?
Who did blow up those apartment buildings?
FSB.
Yeah. Which is Russian military intelligence?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and again, this is our underlying thesis, right? Is that sometimes these conspiracies are used to consolidate power, are used to further the interests of power brokers who already have the power. Hopefully, and I've been trying to avoid promising future episodes, but we're going to see a disinformation campaign later in the year in which big oil did something like this, right? So again, conspiracies generated by people in power that look to us just like the kind of subversive underground truth that we've been looking for, actually playing us and actually making us more vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we have responsibilities to not simply accept official stories as we're being given them by people in power and mainstream media.
Yep.
We have a responsibility to not necessarily accept those things and be skeptical.
Yeah.
We have the same responsibility to do that with conspiracy theories.
Exactly.